a few months ago, the Metal Dude started putting together my heavy metal hard rock Hall of Fame. And I started way back at the beginning with Led Zeppelin. But tonight, on heavy metal's birthday, our second nominee into the Metal Dude Hall of Fame has to be the legendary, the ones that started it all, Black Sabbath, tonight. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. If you've been following this channel, you know we've been chronicling the best hard rock and heavy metal from all the way back to the late 60s to modern day. We go by year and talk about the heavy metal or hard rock that deserved all the accolades for that year. But we're also starting a new series where we recognize the absolute greatest, the absolute legends in the music business by starting our own Metal Dude Hall of Fame. As much as the Grammys have ignored or misunderstood metal, so has the Hall of Fame. It takes an act of Congress to get them to recognize good heavy metal. And there are many metal bands that should be in the Hall of Fame that aren't. So as we're correcting all the errors that the Grammys have made over the year, so shall we correct the errors and the omissions in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by starting a much more prestigious club, the Metal Dude Hall of Fame. And our second nominees were a slam dunk. Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward invented heavy metal. So as we were coming up on yet again our heavy metal birthday, I thought it would be an excellent occasion to put into the Hall of Fame the great, the pioneers, Black Freakin Sabbath. Now, I thought it would be a good idea, as an idea for these nomination awards is to do a discography. So we're going to go through the Black Sabbath albums, just the original group with Ozzy, Tony, Geezer, and Bill. We're just going to go through those albums. We'll save the Dio years, the Gillan albums, the Tony Martin era. We're going to save all that for later. Tonight's just celebrating the pioneers, the originals. So we're going to go through that first run of albums, and we're going to rank them from top to bottom. Let's get started. All right, this episode is meant to celebrate Black Sabbath, to talk about all the great songs and albums in their illustrious history. So let's get the negative stuff out of the way right off the bat. The last two Black Sabbath songs they did with the original lineup are terrible. Let's just keep it 100. You can't properly celebrate the great albums if you don't acknowledge how much better they were than these albums. The last two are terrible. And let me tell you why. It seems as if Tony Iommi had felt that the Black Sabbath sound had gone stale. So he wanted to move them in a much more commercial direction. Ozzy himself said, and I quote, Tony was wanting us to sound more like Foreigner, more like Queen. Listen, Queen is a fine band. I love Foreigner, but I don't want Black Sabbath to sound like Queen or Foreigner. And so Tony Iommi was trying to change their identity and freshen it up. Now, on the flip side, Ozzy was having none of it. This is when a lot of that internal combustion started to happen with Black Sabbath, because Ozzy did not understand why Tony was moving them in this other direction. Again, to quote Ozzy, he was like, listen, we influenced Foreigner, we influenced Queen, we influenced these bands. Why are we now following them? Ozzy felt like the Sabbath sound should have remained. And in this instance, I can't agree more, because the last two albums they produced just don't sound like Sabbath. At the end of the day, maybe you like them, great, but I don't feel like they sound remotely like Sabbath. Number 8 on this list, to me, has to be Technical Ecstasy. I don't really like a single song on this album. I'm trying to find something positive here. The very last track, Dirty Women, not too bad, but they got song on here like It's All Right. They're trying to sound like the Beatles. Like it sounds like Paul McCartney is leading the band, not Tony Iommi or whatnot. Rock and Roll Doctor sounds a lot like Kiss. They've got a sappy ballad called She's Gone. They kind of sound at times like Deep Purple or Uriah Heep. It's just not Black Sabbath up to that level. Listen, the first few Sabbath albums are amongst the greatest albums of all time. AC/DC has been infamously criticized, I guess, for making the same album 20 times or whatever the case may be. But if it's a great album, remaking it is fine. The Black Sabbath sound did not need to be changed. The new wave of British heavy metal in a few years would honor that sound, and they would have been right back to where they were. But because they got off, they just kind of skidded off the runway there right before heavy metal became the big thing. In the late 70s, let's be honest, heavy metal was not a popular music genre. And so there was a lot of bands who decided to pull the chute and head a different direction, only to then be left behind when the heavy metal explosion happened just a couple of years later. Black Sabbath was lost. Technical Ecstasy is a stinker. Now, the next album I'm going to discuss, coming in at number 7, wasn't much better. That album, their final one with Ozzy, Never Say Die. So why does Never Say Die get one step above Technical Ecstasy? The title track is pretty good. Like Never Say Die, it again doesn't sound like Sabbath, but it's at least got a catchy tune. Johnny Blade's kind of an interesting song, and I don't know if you listen to it, it sounds like one of those spy shows, kind of a, don't know how to describe it, but they kind of had that kind of dee. Austin Powers does it a lot in his shows, that kind of sound. That's what I always hear with Johnny Blade. As far as a deep cut goes, I think Shockwave's pretty good, but again, this album, there's a lot of you feel like you walked into a jazz nightclub when you're listening to this, to the point Ozzy was so pissed by this point he wouldn't even agree to sing the last song, Swinging Chain. They had to convince Bill Ward to come in and sing that song. Ozzy was done. He hated this music. That's why they fired him. Well, and everybody was high as kites as well, but I have to agree with Ozzy. This is a terrible era of Black Sabbath music. Let's just bury this. Let's not talk about it anymore. The rest of this show, let's talk about the great stuff, because the first 6 albums that Black Sabbath put together are worth celebrating. I do want to depart from the list just for a second. I do not include the album 13 in this rankings list because I stand in solidarity with Bill Ward, who was not included on that big comeback album. And the fact of the matter is, we're talking about an album that was made decades after this original run. So this list is only the albums that had all 4 of the original members. So 13 got the boot. All right. So coming in at number 6, The Great Sabotage. Now, this is going to maybe be where this list starts to get a little controversial, because when you start talking about 6 fantastic albums, when you rank one at number 6, people are going to say, well, why don't you like that album? I think, let's just get it out of the way. I hated those last 2 Black Sabbath albums, but I like to love all of these albums. They're all very good. Sabotage starts... The one thing about Sabotage that I will maybe quibble with a bit, I've heard many people, including one prominent music critic who really tends to know his heavy metal stuff, that not only is Sabotage the very best Black Sabbath album, might be the very best heavy metal album of all time. And that I don't see. Obviously, I think there's 5 Sabbath albums better than this one, but it is very good. I'm not quite sure. Black Sabbath goes through, in the early years, we'll talk about the doom and the stoner metal that they kind of created. At this point, they've kind of added a progressive experimental stage in there at this point. So if you really like or lean towards the more sophisticated stylings of progressive metal of that day, that's why you probably put this one way above the others. I'm not a real big fan of 1970s progressive rock, which is why I probably put this one a little lower than most people. Again, this is really good, but in my humble opinion, has no way, shape, or form any claim to being the best Black Sabbath album. Let's just get that out of the way. But the album starts out great. Hole in the Sky, what a way to start the album. Very, very good. And listen, no matter what you think of this album, Symptom of the Universe is one of the all-time great Black Sabbath songs. And here I will agree, one of the all-time greatest heavy metal songs of all time. What a fantastic song. Megalomania is one of those songs that's a little bit of a sleeper, a deeper cut that I just find mesmerizing. I really like. Thrill of It All is pretty good. After Thrill of It All, it kind of fades off a little bit, which is another reason why I think it has to remain in this spot. I don't think the whole album, that first side though, those first, 5 songs are all just unbelievably good. And then, like I said, I'm not a fan of Superstar. I'm not a fan of, I hear a lot of people really like The Writ. Doesn't do anything for me. But again, when you get into these Sabbath albums, you have to be nitpicky to move them up and down the scale. Again, I will put it here at number 6. Albums 7 and 8 were very close. But here on the list is maybe the toughest ranking spot. The next 2 albums are so incredibly close to one another in quality that you really just have to kind of take a personal preference view here. But coming in at number 5 is Black Sabbath Volume 4. In the end, I knocked it down just a notch because it doesn't have that great, heavy song. Symptoms of the Universe, song like that. It has some great songs, but they're all a little bit different. Let's start with the song that's probably the biggest hit off this album, Changes. Now, I see a lot of people shit on this song because it is a ballad and it is mellow. But let me just throw the flip side to that. Let's be completely honest. As far as a pure vocalist goes, Ozzy is not a great singer, right? His value that he brings to the band is in showmanship, but he also has a great way of evoking emotion. If Ozzy sings a song about being sad, you really genuinely feel the sadness. If he sings a song about elation and joy, you really feel joy. Ozzy has that special connection to his fans that is more important than true, vocal prowess. And in this song, Changes, Ozzy's voice never sounds better than right here. And that emotion that Ozzy brings into this song makes it an all-time classic. Changes is probably the best song on this album. The other song that I really like on this, Supernaut. But again, it's kind of a different departure. This is where Black Sabbath kind of gets out of that doomy stoner metal, and kind of starts getting into some experimental sounds. Supernaut's kind of almost upbeat, kind of funky song, but it works. I love this song as well. One interesting note, as I'm prepping you for an episode in the future, I love the song Snowblind, but we're going to talk about this in a little bit. I first discovered many of these songs on Ozzy's live album, Speak of the Devil. And that album gets a lot of criticism because they kind of speed up Sabbath just a bit. So when I first heard Snowblind, the Brad Gillis version, right, I was like, this is a great song. And then you come back to the studio version of Snowblind, and it's a little slower. And so I actually kind of, when I want to listen to this song, I go back to the Speak of the Devil version of it, not this one, just one of those things. A lot of times, we've talked about this on other albums too. Sometimes a studio album, when they put it to live, speed it up just a notch. A practice that I don't see much anymore. Most of the time you see an album, whether it's performed live or on the studio album, it's the same. But this was kind of a trope they did back in the 70s. And this is one of those songs that benefits from just a little bit of a speed up. But all that to say, Changes, Supernaut, Snowblind. This is an unbelievable, great album from Black Sabbath. And it comes in at number 5. So what edged out Volume 4, you might ask? Well, coming in at number 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Razor thin, but listen, back to the epic moments on this album and the heavy moments on this album, just slightly more. That first, the title track, right off the bat, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, one of my favorite all-time Tony Iommi riffs. I love it. National Acrobat, Sabra Cadabra, Killing Yourself to Live, like those, that start to this album is just amazing. Now, this album does suffer a little bit like Sabotage in that after Killing Yourself to Live, it's okay. Spiral Architect is a very good song, but it doesn't quite raise up to the level of those first few songs. Ironically, Fluff, a little instrumental here that Tony Iommi puts on this album, makes it all the way to their double live album with Ronnie James Dio. So they must have really liked Fluff, and it is very good. This is that era of Sabbath where almost on every album, Tony Iommi does like a little acoustical song in between a couple of big heavies. And I think of those types of songs, Fluff, sure, might be the best of the bunch. So all in all, this album, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, rises up all the way to number 4. Okay, true confession time. As good as the last couple of albums we've talked about are, I truly believe that the best Black Sabbath albums are the first 3 Black Sabbath albums. They are incredible. They are pioneering. They are influential, all of the above. The only question is, how do I rank these top 3? So coming in at number 3, the original Black Sabbath, Black Sabbath. I cannot even imagine what it must have been like to be around in 1970 when this bad boy came out. Keep in mind, when I come into the heavy metal world, we're talking 7, 8 years later. When this came out, I was still a little kid. I was still listening to Wheels on the Bus. I was a little tot. When I got into music, there was a lot of good hard rock. There was a lot of good heavy metal. When this came out, this blew everything away, much like Zeppelin, but even to a bigger extent. I can't even imagine, like, the music that they had at that time When this thing came out, it was so much more heavier, so much more doomier, so much more darker than anything that had come before it. It had to have been a complete shock to the system. And on this album are some of my absolute favorite songs. If you said to me, okay, rank these albums by like taking the top 3 songs off each of them, this one might shoot all the way to number 1. It starts off with the legendary song Black Sabbath. Rolling Stone recently ranked this the absolute greatest Black Sabbath song of all time. I won't go that far. I don't think it's their best, but clearly it's their most influential, because this is where it all started. This is where Black Sabbath changed music. This song right here. But I gotta say, I got a soft spot for the Wizard. Ozzy Osbourne on harmonica. It doesn't seem like it would fit, but oh my goodness. This was when I first went back and found Black Sabbath. Man, I gravitated to this song. I really love the Wizard. And NIB, ooh, that bass line by Geezer Butler. Like, we don't talk a lot about bass players on the channel because there's guitars and drums and singers and all of the things that take prominence. But Geezer Butler redefined bass, much like Steve Harris does when he shows up on the scene in the 80s with Iron Maiden. Geezer Butler, you can't find a better bass player than this guy. He reigned supreme for at least the first decade plus of heavy metal. What a great, and find a better bass line than NIB. Holy cow. This thing is fantastic. 3 tremendous songs. But you know what? Wicked World's also good. And I gotta tell you, when I did not get this album before I got like a compilation. So one of my first Black Sabbath albums was called We Sold Our Souls for Rock and Roll. And it was, like I said, it kind of compiled the first 4 albums. And so they had on that album, they had Warning on there, but in it's just by itself, not the whole, 14-minute extravaganza where they have several songs. I love the Warning. Remember what we talked about with Changes? Ozzy can emote emotion. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I think this is my favorite Ozzy vocal performance right here on Warning. I just love it. It's just hypnotizing. It's just so addicting. Anyway, there's 2 Sabbath albums that I'm going to put ahead of this, but do not look past the fact at how great of an album this is and how influential this became. We still have the heavy metal genre, 55 years later, all because of this album right here. And it does deserve all the kudos and all the celebrations. Coming in at number 2, Master of Reality. I love this album. Back to that 3-song challenge. This song starts off with Sweet Leaf, After Forever, a little bit of an instrumental in there, and then Children of the Grave. You talk about 3 absolutely tremendous songs. Now, this album, many people, we talked about the first one being so doomy. This is considered the grandfather of stoner metal, and it starts off right there with Sweet Leaf. It's kind of unique, it's kind of original, but I kind of like it. The opening to Sweet Leaf is obviously Tony Iommi taking a big hit of marijuana and kind of coughing it out. That's how they start the song. Kind of hilarious. But Sweet Leaf, really good. After Forever. This is, this might catch a lot of people by surprise, because this song espouses the virtues of Christianity and following Jesus Christ. Now, Black Sabbath, you wouldn't think would, but here it is. Listen to the lyrics. I love this song, and it is unique in that at this point, Black Sabbath hasn't decided, we're going to be evil and we're going to be against Christianity. They're singing the virtues of it here. A very unique song, maybe in the history of heavy metal. You can't find, even the Christian bands don't have songs promoting Christianity this good. And then finally, Children of the Grave would be one of my nominees for the best Black Sabbath song of all time. I love that thundering opening gallopy riff. We could sit here and do an entire special on just the fantastic riffs of Tony Iommi. He just pulls out riffs left and right on every album that are just insane. But yeah, this is one of those albums. The second side of this album is also very good. Don't get me wrong, but this is one of those albums that the side A is just so incredibly loaded that I really never listened much to side B, just because I love this side of the album so much. Master of Reality comes in as a strong number 2, but it just couldn't topple the absolute pinnacle of Black Sabbath, a perfect album. I've listened to many people do discographies of Black Sabbath, and I'm always surprised. It almost seems like everybody picks an album different than the obvious one. And I think it's because people sometimes, when you make a list, you don't want to just state the obvious, duh. And over the years, you've listened to this album so many times that you start to get maybe a little tired of it, and you start gravitating to another album in the collection. But any Black Sabbath discography that doesn't have this one at top, I believe is factually just incorrect. Because Paranoid is not just a great album. It is one of those rare, perfect albums. Every song on it is great. Every song on it is placed perfectly within the album. And just also, it happens to be Black Sabbath's most commercially successful album. It's got it all. The reason this thing's commercially successful is because, again, it doesn't have a bad song on it. Let's go through these tracks. There's no Black Sabbath album that can compete with this. You start off with War Pigs. Generals gathered in their masses. What a way to start an album. This is, again, right through the heart of the Vietnam War, this is one of the best war protest songs you'll ever hear. Then it's followed up with arguably their greatest hit. Now, this is where I personally am tired of this song. Okay, I've heard it, I think at last count, 7,038 times. But there's a reason I've heard it 7,038 times. It was one of the biggest hits of all time, and it is very good. And kind of a signature Ozzy song, the title track, Paranoid. Now, those two songs are very commercially successful. Then you drop into Planet Caravan, which is just like out there, but I love it. So, like, this is maybe that start of that kind of stoner metal. This is a very groovy song. And then you go right back into the hit. We talk about a signature moment from Ozzy. We talk about a signature moment from Tony Iommi. They're both right here. That opening riff and Ozzy belting out, I am Iron Man. If someone said this is the greatest Black Sabbath song of all time, I can't argue with this. This is iconic. And even Iron Man says this is kind of the song that ends the great Iron Man 1 movie. But where sometimes the Sabbath albums on side 2 get a little bit meandering, this thing just keeps moving. Electric Funeral, Hand of Doom, two of the most underrated Sabbath songs you'll ever hear. Really don't get the credit they deserve. Both are excellent, heavy songs. Rat Salad, it's time to talk about the great Bill Ward. Doesn't always get all the credit that he's deserving of because he plays a little bit differently. He kind of has a jazz influence. He doesn't stick with the band once Dio comes in. You see Vinny Appice come in. They go through a series of drummers, whatnot. But Bill Ward absolutely kills it. And while Tony Iommi usually saves that spotlight for his little guitar solos, his little acoustic deal, here he shares the spotlight. This is absolutely Bill Ward at his finest. And finally, who doesn't love Fairies Wear Boots? I would say this is a great deep track, but everybody knows it. This isn't really as much as a deep track as one of those cult classics that everybody knows, everybody loves. No, it's not a hit, but it is absolutely fan-freaking-tastic. I'm sorry. You can make arguments for all these albums because they are all very good, but there is no way that you can top Black Sabbath, Paranoid, one of the greatest heavy metal albums from Black Sabbath and from any band all time. That's why they're going into the Hall of Fame. This is untouchable, folks. This is the great stuff. And to think they invented this music. Not only, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Not only is this music great, they weren't following anybody else's lead. They came up with this. This album came out the exact same year as Black Sabbath. So they put out 2 albums that first year. This was, like I said, the people that are around this time, I can't imagine what they were thinking when Iron Man came blaring up across their stereo speakers. Phenomenal stuff. Congratulations, a well-deserved Hall of Fame entry. Once again, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, the godfather of the riff, Geezer Butler, best bass player on planet Earth, and the great Bill Ward. This is why they are our second Hall of Fame nominee. Congratulations to Black Sabbath, paving the way for many more great bands that will follow them into the Hall of Fame. They were definitely the influence of generations of heavy metal music. And that's our episode. This is where I get to pitch the channel. Hey, listen, it's heavy metal's birthday. Heavy metal is celebrating its 55th birthday. Come on. Do something different. Subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell. Give it a thumbs up. Do all the things that the YouTube algorithm loves. And we'll grow this channel, and we'll talk about all sorts of great music together, like Black Sabbath, like Led Zeppelin. I've hinted this at some other videos, but we might have a third nominee coming up pretty quickly that might surprise you. So you want to know when we put a new member into the Hall of Fame. You want to know when we talk about the best music year by year. The only way to do that is to be alerted and never miss an episode. So do that now. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.